But you should not worry or speculate about what takes place in those conferences in your absence. As I said, we will merely be considering questions of law or other administrative matters that are required to be heard and dealt with out of your presence. All of the competent evidence in the case will be presented to you while you're present together in the courtroom. And then upon completion of the evidence, the lawyers will make their final arguments to you. Just as opening statements are not evidence, the final arguments of the lawyers are not evidence, but are given to assist you in evaluating the evidence. And then finally, before you retire to consider your verdict or verdicts, I will give you further instructions on the law which applies to this case. At that time, I will explain the law to you that arises from the evidence, and then you will go into the jury room to begin your deliberations. So while you serve as a juror, you must remember and obey the following rules. I gave these to you in detail yesterday. I'll give them to you in a summary fashion right now. As before, do not talk or communicate about this case with anyone, not even among yourselves, until you've been instructed to begin deliberations. If anyone does communicate with you or in your presence or attempts to do so, you must report that to me promptly. While you're serving as a juror, until I say to begin deliberations, do not form the ultimate opinion as to whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty. Now, naturally, you will be in the process of forming opinions about the case as you go along, but keep an open mind until you've heard all of the evidence, until you've heard the arguments of the lawyers, the court's instructions as to the law, and then when I say to begin deliberations, sit down together with your fellow jurors, express your opinions about the case, listen to it and consider the opinions of your fellow jurors about the case, all in an attempt to arrive at a unanimous verdict or verdicts in this case. As before, do not have any contact or talk or communicate or have any, as I said, contact with any of the lawyers, parties, or witnesses outside of open court. This is a prohibition against any type of contact, not just limited to the case. This is a wise precaution against any improper contact or influence and will avoid even the appearance of any impropriety. You can imagine if you were involved in a case from whatever perspective, whether you were accused of a crime or an alleged victim or a family member or an interested witness or whatever the perspective might be, and you saw somebody else similarly situated engaged in a private conversation with a juror, you might think something highly inappropriate or improper is going on, and it could be something as innocuous as talking about the weather or asking for directions or something. Again, it's a way to avoid even the appearance of any impropriety and is a wise precaution against any improper contact or influence. Next, do not let yourselves be exposed to any news media accounts or any other reports of the trial outside of the courtroom. If you are exposed to any such accounts, inadvertently or otherwise, bring it to my attention. Remember, your verdict must be based solely and exclusively on the evidence presented to you and the law that I instruct you on. Finally, and still importantly, do not visit any of the scenes or the places which may be the subject matter of this trial. Do not undertake any independent inquiry, research, or investigation into anything related to this case, whether it's about the facts involved or as to the law involved. Among other things, that includes, as I said, no internet research, no Googling or search engine work of any type. Remember, you are not the investigators of the case, you are the deciders of the case, and you are to decide it on the evidence presented to you here in the courtroom. Each of you must obey each of these rules to the letter. Unless you do so, there's no way that the parties can be assured of absolute fairness and impartiality. It is your duty while you serve as a juror to see that you remain a fair and impartial trier of the facts. If you violate any of these rules, you would be violating an order of the court, and that is something that could subject you to punishment as provided by law for contempt of court. It's uncomfortable to say that to you. You didn't volunteer to be here. You're compelled to be here, and I'm talking about contempt of court and punishment of jurors. It is a reminder of the seriousness of these rules and the seriousness of your duties. Many times you will hear me say, repeat those rules, but many times you will hear me say, remember and follow the rules. Before I recognize the lawyers for opening statements, do you have any questions? Seeing or hearing none, then the court recognizes Mr. Waller for an opening statement for the state.
Thank you, Your Honor.
defendant's name was given to you as Thomas Matthews. Make it clear that is a reference to Charles Joseph Matthews. So Thomas Matthews is not the defendant. So at this time, to formally take care of this, I'll ask the clerk to re-impanel the jury, including the alternates. And thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Sorry, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've all been duly sworn and are now paneled to hear the evidence for the state of Charles Matthews and Kimberly Matthews. Please sit together, hear the evidence, and render your verdict accordingly.
All right, thank you. You are further now impaneled with regard to the case of State of North Carolina versus Charles Joseph Matthews and State of North Carolina versus Kimberly Hunt Matthews. As I told you earlier, the trial of these charges, that is, these charges have been joined for trial and these defendants have been joined for trial. Thank you for that, Mr. Miles. And now the court recognizes Mr. Waller for an opening statement for the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court?
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Miles.
You may proceed.
Jonathan Gregory Taylor, JT as he was known to his friends, died on June 28th of 2014 at 10:37 p.m. He died driving his vehicle at a speed of approximately 89 miles per hour. He hit a tree and he died instantly. When he was sent off to the medical examiner's office, they did an external autopsy and found at the time that he was driving, he had an alcohol concentration of 0.20. JT had gone to a wedding at the Matthews residence at 904 Vance Street that evening. He had been invited to that wedding by their son, Thomas Matthews. The invite was extended earlier that afternoon. JT accepted and joined Thomas at that wedding, along with 3 other teenage friends, Anna Ergish, Natalie Freeman, and Josh McCoy. You will hear that JT and Thomas were planning to drink at that wedding. That they did drink at that wedding. And that all of the teenagers, or the kids, except for Josh McCoy, became highly intoxicated that night. Anna Ergish became so intoxicated that they had to call EMS to the residence to check her out. Natalie Freeman became so intoxicated that she had to go into a basement and pass out or throw up and have her father come and pick her up. And of course, JT made the decision to drive home that night, and he paid the ultimate price. That's the end of the story. What this case is going to be about is how these teenagers got to that point. How these kids got to the point of driving drunk, having to have EMS called, throwing up in a basement to the point where your parents have to be called. How did we get there? That's what this trial is about. This trial is about the responsibility of Dr. Charles Matthews and Mrs. Kimberly Matthews in what they did that night to allow this to happen. And I want to be clear on one thing before we get started, and I think it was mentioned in jury selection. They're not charged with murder. They're not charged with manslaughter. They're charged with 4 counts of aiding and abetting underage consumption of alcohol. That's what we're here to decide, if they are responsible for that and how their actions led to what happened later that night. The facts or evidence that you hear in this case, I don't think will be in much dispute. You are going to hear that these 4 kids were at the wedding. You're going to hear that prior to the wedding, they went, Thomas, JT, Anna, and Natalie, to a local ABC store at Cameron Village. You're going to hear that Thomas walked in and bought a bottle of Jack Daniels. He was not carded. He received that bottle. They went back to the Matthews neighborhood, across the street and they took shots off that bottle. They passed it around. The parents did not know about this bottle of Jack Daniels. This all happened prior to the wedding. They finish off that to the ceremony. And then we get to the point where the Matthews become involved. After the ceremony, there was these they saw them drinking the wine and the champagne, and nobody stopped them. You will see pictures in which Dr. Matthews and Mrs. Matthews are right there near them, and they did nothing to stop them. You'll see that the reception moved to the backyard of the Matthews residence. You will again see that these four teenagers, kids, sat at a cocktail table right beside the bar. Glasses in front of them, drinking wine, drinking champagne. This table was literally where the bride had to walk down the aisle to get to her reception. And nobody stopped. You will see and you will hear from Anna and from Natalie that they drank all night to the point they were intoxicated and had to call their parents and call EMS, or EMS was called for Anna. JT was there until about 10:15, and then the crash happened at 10:37. You will hear from Carrie Taylor, JT's mother, that JT sent her a text saying, "Come pick me up." That his father, Trooper Taylor, came to find him. Couldn't find him at the Matthews residence. Between the text of coming to get me and the time Trooper Taylor got there, JT left. But what you will also hear from Carrie Taylor is that there were calls to the Matthews residence trying to find out where JT was. And there was a later return call from Carrie Taylor, from Mrs. Matthews, acting as if she didn't know what had happened to JT. Well, the interesting thing, ladies and gentlemen, that you also hear about is after the crash, an officer went over to the Matthews residence. And you will hear directly from Officer Wall, but you will hear from him that there was just things were not right when he went and interviewed them. He says he saw someone in the kitchen. Mrs. Matthews denies anyone else being there at the residence. Dr. Matthews comes down and immediately says JT is dead when Officer Wall hasn't even said anything. They knew, ladies and gentlemen, they knew what had happened that night. You will hear a 911 call in which Dr. Matthews says that they have been drinking at my house and Anna Ergish is passed out to the point that she needs EMS. There's not a picture in this case of Dr. Matthews or Mrs. Matthews with their arm around JT or Anna or Natalie and handing them a glass of wine. But what there is in this case is evidence that they were around it, that this was happening out open in the public, and that their statements afterwards through the 911 call and to Officer Wall acknowledge that they knew these teenagers were drinking there that night. This case is about responsibility, about allowing these four underage teenagers to drink at their house, out in the open. Your job at the end of the case will be to decide what responsibility they bear. Could they have put a stop to this? That's what this case is about. Could they have prevented this? Did they facilitate this? Did they aid in this ultimate conclusion. That's why we're here. That's why you're here. That's why everybody's here. I thank you for the attention that you've shown so far, and I thank you for the attention that you'll show during the course of this trial. At the end of the case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to take what you hear from this witness stand, the evidence in the case, and the law that Judge Smith instructs you on, the law that you agreed to follow. And we'll talk about how those two things come together, how they mesh, to show that the Matthews are responsible for providing alcohol to these underage kids. I thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Obviously, a very strong opening statement by Mr. Waller, and you should consider it. But it's a forecast, and like the judge said, we're talking about right now what we expect the evidence to show. And in this particular case, obviously, the Matthews are presumed innocent, and the burden of proof is on the state. And the accusations are criminal, as we talked about before. So keep that in mind when you're evaluating the evidence. There was a plan in place for June 28th of 2014. Didn't really have anything to do with Thomas Matthews or any of his friends, and you heard on numerous occasions that Mr. Waller referred to them as kids and teenagers, but let's talk about what the evidence will show their ages were. They were four 18-year-olds and one 17-year-old. Natalie Freeman being the 17-year-old. So I'm going to call them young adults or Thomas's friends, but you'll hear that their ages were 18 and 17. The plan for the wedding had been set in place or put in place by Kimberly Matthews, known as Kim, my client, and her daughter. And her daughter is Nicole Kanopoulos. And Nicole Kanopoulos is a child by previous marriage. She's 27 years old at the time. They had planned to have her wedding to Jason Kazor at the home on Vance Street of Chip and Kim Matthews. It's a beautiful home, and you'll see pictures of it. It's a large home. It's a big piece of property. They decided that they wanted 50 to 60 guests there, approximately half being family, half being friends. They coordinated the guest list, and they met with a caterer, and the caterer was Cafe Parazad. And their connection to the caterer was the owner of that business, who was interviewed by Raleigh police, is a man named George Bakasha. George was an old family friend of Kimberly, and Kim and her previous husband had known him, and he has a restaurant named Cafe Parazad that's in Durham, North Carolina. So they met, Kim and Nicole met with an event manager there, and his name was Josh Weaver, and talked about the schedule of the wedding and what was supposed to happen when. And like most weddings, there was a set schedule that they wanted to follow. They wanted the wedding to be, the ceremony to be at 7:30, and they wanted it to be over by about 10:30. And in between, they had different things that were supposed to happen. So as far as logistically, the ceremony was to happen on the back patio. They had chairs set out for the ceremony. The ceremony was supposed to happen at 7:30. After the ceremony was over, pictures in the back of the family. During that period of time, the rest of the guests were invited to go to the front of the house, to the front porch area, front yard area, to have a cocktail. And that ended up being about half the people there. About half the people were family, about half the people were other guests. So the plan was that there was a small bar there with one or two bartenders, I expect the evidence to show, and a small bar with beer, wine, champagne, water. Those are your choices to drink. And after that period of time, while the pictures were being taken, guests have a cocktail or a glass of water or whatever they want. And I think the evidence will show that the bartenders would pour it or hand it to you. You could get a glass if you wanted a glass for your beer. If you wanted a glass for your water, you get a glass for your water. After that, there was while the bar was going in the front, at the back, the caterers were busy setting up for dinner. A DJ was setting up to play music, and once the pictures were over, the group in the front, the guests in the front, were invited to the back patio where there were tables and chairs, some high tops, some low tops, and the food was set up on a big table and they served themselves, and there was one bar set up there. The front bar was shut down at that point. So there was just one bar in the back after the family pictures. So the evidence will show that the guests served themselves, people were eating, that Nicole and Jason went upstairs to eat just by themselves, just to have a little moment alone after the ceremony. And then they made the next big event in the wedding, they made their entrance into the back patio and had their first dance. And that was the plan, their first dance together. And I expect a lot of the pictures that you're gonna see of Thomas and his friends with wine glasses on their table are during that very part of the wedding. After the first dance, they had other family dances with parents, as you might have seen in other weddings, parents and dancing with the groom and bride, and that took a period of time. People kept eating and so forth and socializing, and then the next big event, the cutting of the cake. And at the cutting of the cake, there was champagne served if you wanted champagne, and I think you'll hear the bartenders talk about that part of the wedding too. And most of the facts will not be in dispute, but I think one fact that you'll see that's in dispute is that Anna and Natalie, Anna Urgis, Natalie Freeman, will testify that they went to the bars, both bars, and were served from the bartenders at Cafe Paradise. But the bartenders will say that they did not serve them. That will be a key factual dispute in the case. But coming back to the cutting of the cake and the champagne, that was the last official event. After that was supposed to happen 9:30, 9:45. Wedding's supposed to be over at 10:30. That was the plan. Now, Thomas and his friends had a different plan. And what happened was Thomas asked four of his friends, Mr. Waller identified, Anna Urgis, Natalie Freeman, Josh McCoy, Jonathan Taylor, known as JT, asked them to come kind of last minute to the wedding. And Natalie was supposed to be Thomas's date, and Anna was supposed to be JT's date, and Josh was there on his own. As Mr. Waller described to you, their plan included trying to make this a party for themselves. Their plan, which I expect evidence to show was selfish and inconsiderate and reckless, was to go to the Cameron Village ABC store right before the wedding. Thomas goes in with no ID but a tuxedo on, buys some Jack Daniels. And I think the evidence will be everybody knew what he was doing. Everybody in the car knew what he was doing, JT and Anna and Natalie, because it was for all of them. Comes back to the car, buys it, inexplicably does not get carded by the ABC employee. Comes back to the car, they drive to a location separate from the wedding, where in a very short period of time, the four of them consume an entire fifth of Jack Daniel's whiskey. After that, they come to the wedding. As Mr. Waller described, and how I've described the logistics, they go to the ceremony, and then proceed after the ceremony to go to the front of the house where they attempt to get alcoholic beverages. And I believe the evidence will show, according to the state's witnesses, that they did receive those beverages. During that period of time, Kimberly Matthews and Chip Matthews were at the back of the house with their family taking pictures. The only time the evidence will show that they were ever in the front was at the end of the pictures, coming to get everybody to move to the forward part of the house. The evidence will show, likely, that there was very little interaction between Chip Matthews and Kim Matthews during the course of the night with Thomas and his friends. There was some, but very little. And of course that makes sense because the evidence will show they were spending time with other guests. They were spending time with other family. And Thomas and his friends were keeping sort of in a pack and keeping to themselves. And even though I believe you will see pictures of them with glasses on the table, they were not walking around with glasses of wine and champagne. You may see one picture or two pictures of them. And when I talk about pictures, I expect the photographers to testify. The evidence will show there were 2,600 pictures at least taken at this wedding. 2,600 pictures. Keep that in mind when reviewing that evidence. But it wasn't until close to the end of the wedding when it became apparent that Thomas and his friends were having problems as far as their intoxication. And that Kim Matthews saw JT having problems, took him inside, put him in a place where she thought was a safe and comfortable place, which was in their library, which is right next to the kitchen, which is right at the back of the house near the patio. And I expect the evidence will show that he said that his father was coming to get him. His father, a state trooper. And that at that point too, Natalie Freeman was having problems, and Kim Matthews went to go help deal with Natalie Freeman. I expect the evidence will show that she provided her a towel. The decision was made that Natalie's parents should be called. They were. Her father was. He came and picked her up right around 10:28, 10:30. At some point in that period of time, a guest named Brian Johnson, you'll hear, had a conversation with J.T. Taylor. And I expect evidence will show that Brian Johnson saw that he was impaired and talked to him about not driving a car. And at some point, that conversation ended, and that Brian Johnson was the last person that saw JT before he tried to get home in his car. And obviously, tragically, lost his life somewhere around 10:37. You will hear, I expect, as Mr. Waller said, about what happened afterwards. That is, after the wreck and after JT's death, his parents come upon the wreck as they're looking for him. And they interact with the Raleigh police, and they get the awful, tragic news that they've lost their son. And so that starts a different set of events in motion. And the police send an officer to the home of Kim and Chip Matthews. And at that time, that officer approaches the house, and it's pretty much dark because it's 1 o'clock in the morning. The wedding's been long over. Kim Matthews, no one responds. He tries to get someone's attention in the house. It's a large house. He comes to the side door. I think the evidence will show he was trying to find someone, thinks he sees someone in the house. And finally, as the officer's leaving, Kimberly Matthews comes to the side door and gets the officer's attention and says, "Can I help you with something?" And at that point, there's a conversation there, and I think there'll be some dispute about exactly what was said. But the bottom line was, Kim Matthews at that time had just had a phone call with Carrie Taylor. She had just learned that JT had died. I expect evidence to show. And obviously was troubled by that. And obviously Chip Matthews, who later came into the conversation with the officer, saying JT is dead. JT is dead. Later, officer leaves. Next day, the investigation starts to kick in. Sergeant Hoolan of the Raleigh Police Department, that following Monday, 28th was a Saturday, 29th Sunday. That Monday, Sergeant Hoolan takes the lead in the investigation as it related to drinking at the Matthews house. And you will see the different steps he took in his investigation to determine who to charge in this particular case. The Matthews were targeted very early in that investigation. The bartenders were not, for some unknown reason. The ABC agent was cited for his role in selling the alcohol to Thomas, but the Matthews were arrested along with their son. And here we are. And you're going to have to decide if those allegations, those criminal allegations, are proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and whether or not Chip and Kim Matthews should be convicted criminals. And at the end of this trial, at the end, I'll come and argue to you, based on the law, based on all the evidence or lack thereof, that they should not. And in closing, I also need to tell you what you're not going to hear. And Mr. Waller pointed some of this out. You're not going to see or hear any evidence that Chip or Kim Matthews were drinking with any of Thomas or his friends or giving them alcohol. You're not going to hear any evidence that they gave the bartenders permission to allow Thomas or any of his friends to drink, or that any of Thomas or his friends asked for permission from the Matthews or the bartenders. They were on their own mission to drink. You won't hear any evidence that the Matthews knew that JT had driven to their house for the wedding. JT Taylor's death was a tragedy. The investigation was an emotional response to that tragedy. Please be very critical and look at everything with a clear lens when you evaluate the evidence. And at the end, I'm going to come back and ask you to find both of the Matthews not guilty. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Thanks both.